so we're here today to talk with you about a recent work that we've made called Pheno Tv that's just been released, and we're going to talk over the top of it, and you can watch it again later if you want. It comes in two forms. It's called the 4-minute argument, and there's the full-length form, which is about 27 minutes, which we'll talk over now. And it's made together with a group of other people around the world, I guess, and we've included contributions that people gave us to try and see how a group of people could perhaps, say, passively put together some sort of representation of what's going on or what's going on between us at this kind of time. So we're going to do it in an obsolescent form of the DVD commentary, and it's a bit different to that because with the DVD commentaries they would have like a writer or director or actor or someone talking over the top of the film, and you could listen to it later. But that was usually after the film had already had a big kind of audience reception and had been received and consumed. Whereas in this case, the video's just been released and we don't really know what anyone thinks about it. We don't know what so much we think about it. So the two things that we were starting with was very, very basic issues about where we are, like in what place are we, and that's why it refers to empiricism, and how do you know where you are in a place, and what can you say? But I guess as time went on, more specifically, you know, where does voice come from? When we speak, like, do we say what we want to say, or what the other wants us to say, or like what is it that we're kind of actually saying?
The program more or less starts with an interview with two interviewers, and the first interviewer asks the presenter, Pheno, what is the purpose of a TV show now? To which she then responds, to show what we already know and how we share in that. The second interviewer asking what could be the purpose in collecting what we already know. Pheno responds, how what we think is produced and in what way we do that together. So if we think about the way that we do produce language and knowledge and culture, we become much more aware that culture and knowledge and history have been written and produced through institutional discourses of exclusion. And it's not neutral, and more often than not, it speaks us. So when we make an address, it's relevant to see what we don't know and what we already know, and the way we're making these discourses together, keeping in mind that many of the institutional discourses exclude so many people. And I guess what we're doing here is using the disembodied voice, the problematic status of the voice, because it's a ventriloquist doll that's speaking, and which of those, of course, you know, which is speech, and trying to make that speech material in some kind of way.
And of course, during the period that we were making this, there was a huge amount of changes went on around us. I mean, you can watch the version of this later if you want. Like, we made two versions of this. It's called the 4-minute argument, the shorter version, and then the long one that includes all the contributions that people sent us is 27 minutes long, and it's on YouTube. You can just look it up under Pheno TV. And so, you know, there were so many changes with the, you know, global events that happened while we were making this, that it brought up all sorts of issues. And I suppose in some ways we didn't want to address them really directly, but just leave it up to people how much they want to talk about it. But one of the things that came up that was really interesting, it was about the idea of speech and contagion and speech. Like, I don't know if any of you saw that, but like singing in a choir is about one of the most dangerous things that you can do at the moment, because it makes all these airborne particles. And this bit that's on the screen now, in fact, was sent to us by a friend in Beijing, and he just has put together the 4 haircuts that he had during the lockdown. I mean, I think they're locked down again now, but the 4 haircuts that he had during the lockdown, and then this super positive sort of Disney Communist Party song about how we all have to be positive during the lockdown. But like I said, we weren't really kind of looking to say anything about COVID and what was happening, but to such an extent, like what you can see here now, it's Frances Ferguson. This is something that we made quite a long time ago, and she talks about people's use value and utilitarianism. And so she talks about in terms of pornography and representation. And so, I don't know, we just had made these quite a while ago, and we wanted to expose them again to see if anyone thought anything about it.
And I think that the part of the reason we put this material into the TV show is that it's an expert speaking, and we acknowledge the voice of the expert and think that it's important to come back to the expert and
pornography,
listen to fact and provable ideas and information.
Well, this has a long discursive history in our work. The first project that Jackie and I made together was called Art Fan, and it was in the early 90s, and we invited people who said they didn't know about art to write about art. So as you can see, we're interested in completely the opposite. We were interested in what the audience that didn't know knew, like what do you know when you don't know. And we've sort of followed this thread, you know, through Pasolini, who, you know, like he used a lot of amateur people in his work, and the idea that there was a sort of pagan underbelly to, you know, democratic and Catholic behaviour in Italy, and there was always this other kind of impulsive, perhaps eroticised behaviour, sort of trying to get out. And so we worked a lot around the idea of people who couldn't paint, people who couldn't write, people who couldn't sing, and that, to think about it. But perhaps even a little bit tragically, that what's happened now is that the expert has been disowned so much, and that we're disowning things that seem to be really appropriate by people that have worked really hard to win that knowledge. And so we've gradually been making our way back to the expert. And so instead of popularising what, say, Frances Ferguson or Philip Morrissey, the Professor of Indigenous Studies, that we've tried to leave it in its complexity, but condense it down to something really short. So most of those videos we made for 1 minute.
I got a voice.
We've always used music in our work, and for a part of this program, we invited about 20 people to sing a part of a song. And the song is written by Quinn Christopherson, someone we met in Alaska. And it's about a person who is transgender, and about the way that they felt erased, being in the wrong, courting the wrong gender for a certain period of their life. And so that's become really part of the subject matter of, I guess, the whole program. This idea of the disembodied voice. The disembodied voice is often attributed, or really is, the voice of the female voice. And it's also, it has a very problematic status, which is, of course, means that speech has a problematic status. And trying to make that material is something that we've done a lot in our work. And to see the voice as a performative action, I think, does come across in what we're doing here.
And I think the idea with this voice that's of most interest to us, because, like, I mean, even though it sounds serious, some of the things we're talking about, it's also pretty stupid at times and full of mistakes. And, you know, that's been something that we've courted for a long time. But, I mean, I think that what we're really interested in is this idea of materialism and where the disembodied voice is, like whether it's a material thing that you can actually locate, is where the place that we speak, like rather than talking about democracy and things, they were trying to think about like the actuality of like where we speak from, like what's the physical place that we speak from and to, maybe.
Well, perhaps, you know, we're attempting to be present in a here and now that most of us don't really relate to. So what can we do about that? And one thing is we can take responsibility, but maybe that's a larger conversation that we don't have time for. But, you know, to come back to this idea of the voice, the disembodied voice, which could be like a voice heard in utero or a ghost, but more so here, I think it's the off voice, the voice that allows for the unseen and the contradictory exceptions and the enunciations that are produced. And Pheno's voice is really implicit in that, and it's intuitive. And the voice of the speaker, the speakers, in this sense, has a performative function.
So the bit that we're looking at now is the philosopher and, I don't know, really call him a chef. He makes bonkai with lots of people, and he's a philosopher and an incredibly good cook. And we've been to events that he's done for cooking for like 120 people, even kind of more. And it's about, he's got this idea about inoperativity, that what are you doing when you're eating and just talking to people and you're kind of doing nothing, that what is the sort of material value of that. And so he's made this really bad Zoom, annoyingly bad Zoom. We tried it about 3 times and we just couldn't get the quality any better than that. But so he cooks something very, very simple in the south of France. He lives in Arles in the south of France, and he cooks something extremely simple and then talks about a very complicated relation of phenomenology and fear at the same time. So he's sort of putting 2 things, that's the longest thing in the show that we did, and he's putting in something that is very immediate and accessible in terms of this anchiova, this tomato pasta from Sicily, and then with that he's talking about something about trying to make a physical representation of what we may be all feeling, or something like that. That this is, I mean, where is the part you can't speak from, and could we make a pattern for that, or could we make a map or a location or something like that to talk about, like rather than being depressed or rather than being oppressed, or that where could we find a place to speak from? That's basically what's interested in us.
And he talks about virality in terms of this idea of the virus and the way the virus requires a host to manifest and to change and to be passed on. And he makes this kind of metaphor with the virus and the creation and the passing on of the virus with, in fact, I guess, you know, the making of artworks or the making of discourse. And so we require being together as people to make something happen, to make a discourse, to find a way of getting ourselves out of the problematic political discourses that exist and cultural discourses that exist. And so in terms of this idea of confinement, we could see it as an attempt to stop this virality and this way of making things or allowing things to happen.
And I think this has some particular kind of relevance in terms of June 2020, because in Australia there's a lot of newspaper things at the moment where we're talking about we don't really need the humanities because they're not real like the science, and they don't lead to employment, and then, but you know, like for us it's just incredibly important that speech is a thing, speech is an object, discourse, shared speech, and knowing how to speak together is a really important thing, and that it's really important to us that it's kind of seen that way, that if you leave out the humanities and you discard the humanities, then you're just left with a whole group of things that speak for themselves, rather than that, you know, that's a table and that's a this and that's a that, as though everything is self-evident. And it's really not the case, because we don't understand most things very well at all, or the words that we use for them, and then we're not really so much in control of the words that we use for things. And so you really need speech, and you really need some kind of short shared discourse, like cooking or like all sorts of things, to be able to, I don't know, examine that together. And so that's what, you know, we're offering into this thing. And, you know, maybe if it gets sent out to everyone, and maybe a few people will get it. And one of the things I would really love, and I'll be enthuse you, I'd really love to have some terrible bad comments on this. You know, I read all these things that there's a carpentry show that Jackie looks at on YouTube, and the guy gets the most awful comments on it, and people, like, they attack everything about him, and he's showing it's just goddamn carpentry, you know. So I'd be really excited if you wanted to insult us in our project, and for whatever reason that you might find that it is.
We're just waiting for the next segment to come up. So Fabian's meal is cooked and ready to eat while he's been giving his mini lecture.
En fait, nous avons besoin nécessairement du processus de viralité pour pouvoir exister, pour pouvoir créer. Donc c'est juste ça, tenir en compte deux choses, que d'une part, on construit une idéologie de la peur.
Fabian, we've invited Fabian to work with us on a number of occasions, and we make performances with often with up to 20 people, and Fabian will prepare something to eat during the performance. While everyone's performing, you can hear the chopping and the cooking. It's all in the same room, and the food is always somehow related to the subject matter of the performance.
Yeah, well, I guess there's sort of three things that in those performances that maybe have nearly come to an end for us now, but in those performances we would think about three things: that we'd have people who didn't know how to sing, singing, people who didn't know how to act, acting, and all of this kind of stuff. And then in the middle of that we would put a discourse that was probably not accessible to the audience that was there, like talking about philosophy, or talking about some really complex thing about virality and phenomenology and this kind of thing. So that in a way that what we're having was like different kinds of not understanding together. And then this next bit, this is John Campbell just being kind of gorgeous and saying how much he really likes somebody and how much it excites him to see someone when they come to town and stuff.
And I think it's the time now for a bit of ecstatic dancing. It's when in doubt, and when one's been through a very difficult period, I think ecstatic dancing is something that brings one back to into one's own body, and to feel what is unpleasant, and to shake it away.
Yeah, he goes. John's doing a bit of what we used to call Sharpie dancing here. There he goes. That's Sharpie dancing.
Teenager of the 70s.
Well, John plays a really big thing with this line. Like, you know, he can sing, but he sort of can't sing, and he can play, and he kind of can't play. And it works into, but you're never really sure of the status of what you're receiving, other than maybe it's kind of like the thing that I suppose with his work shines through is this sort of goodwill with which he presents it, invokes it. So we're coming to you here through kind of layers of fake Zoom, I guess, you know, that it's sort of live, but it's not live. And even this very thing that we're working on now is the same, you know, like that it's got layers of whether it is actually live or whether it's a replayer of a replay of a replay. And we've done quite a lot of things like that. You know, we've done a performative thing with Skype like that in much the same sort of way. Just sort of, it's to try and think about the materiality, and that, you know, that we take all of these things as immediate, as though that they're coming to us and it's actually happening now and things like that. But it's to try and unwrap that a little bit and try and think about it, about like what's happening when you talk to someone. Like Zoom in itself is really complex like this, because most of the schools, like in France and in Australia, and everyone's teaching all of the courses. And a lot of people talk about being really exhausted by doing that. Maybe some students like it so, but anyway, like it's an attempt by us to think about what is a voice, what's an unmediated voice, like something that you believe is someone talking to you right now, like I'm talking to you right now, sort of thing. And what is what's a voice that's being demanded of us, or a voice that's being spoken through?
Well, I think it's quite interesting because I guess a lot of people have been thinking about the way they use social media over the last couple of years, and the way that our data is not protected and information is sold and passed on. And that for some people this is something dangerous and that they don't want to be involved in. And, you know, a lot of people have stopped using Google and Amazon and so on. But the problematic thing was that when we found ourselves in confinement, the way that we could communicate with people, with the family and with other people, was through Zoom and through all these social media. And so we realised how reliant upon it we are, and how much it was used to stay in contact. And some people were in very isolated situations. And I guess it would have been very problematic for some people without that form of communication. So it's a really love-hate relation that I have with this way of communicating with people.
Yeah, because it, you know, like I think it's very demanding and controlling, and that there's a lot of discourse about how it's using us, and how, you know, like a lot of people talk about the idea that we're actually working for free for Facebook and whatever. But at the same time, like, you know, it's hard to imagine now, having gone through this confinement period, how you could even possibly live without it. I've had so much contact with people from other countries, and so much really important and great contact with people from far places during this period of being alone, I guess, you know, in the house and stuff. So yeah, it's going to be up to your generation to think about it much more than us. But, you know, for us, we're just sort of waddling through it or something.
This segment, it's a short discourse on the post-human, and to think of other ways of speaking about people and the human condition to these institutional discourses of power and what can and can't.
It's complex and requires a larger and more serious conversation than we might have here. Certainly there is a lot of anxiety attached to how we speak, what we say and what we mean. Most of us are aware of how we speak individually, subliminally and materially that is being fed back to us via our own contributions to algorithmic data collection, what we freely provide through Facebook, Instagram and WhatsApp. What do we do to alleviate anxiety? Most likely consume. So we're in a moment of convergence of the post-human, post-anthropos, transhuman and so on. What this convergence brings into question.
And if we
is the
see that we're
idea
in this
of the
space
human,
of convergence
and
right
that
now, this is the time to remake the discourse. And if we think about what's going to happen with artificial intelligence and with transhuman possibilities and all of this sort of thing, really we need to think about how we're positioned in that and what that means for some people in the future and not others.
Okay, well, we're nearly at the end now. Be really welcome any of your feedback, and thanks for inviting us to do this. And this is our Pheno Tv project. We're going to do 3 more editions of it. The next one's going to be about liveness. The episode 3 will be about the post-human, and then the last one will be live as a kind of live work.
The next
So,
episode of Pheno TV will be
hope
about
you're all
concept of
doing
liveness.
well, and really look forward to seeing some of you next year, I hope, in Prato.
Presented by Pheno, produced by A Constructed World in collaboration with Creative Yuk. Ask him a question, interview him. Posez-lui une question, interviewez-le. Ponetegli una domanda, intervistatelo. Le prochain épisode de Pheno TV sera autour du concept de liveness. Talk to him by telepathy.